Right, so we'll now talk about the descending pathways. So remember when we're doing the ascending pathways, I said mostly ascending pathways are sensory. So motor pathways are the ones that are mostly going to be descending. But as we're doing this, I'm sure you know that even when you're doing the general anatomy and histology, there are two components for motor commands. There is the somatic or the voluntary motor command, which is now for most of the muscles that we did in the upper limb, the lower limb, anterior abdominal wall, anterior thoracic wall, and even muscles of the back, which were the skeletal muscle. Those are what we call the somatic component. Then we have a visceral component, which we can also refer to as the autonomic component, where we talk about parasympathetic and sympathetic. Right. Those are a little bit minor pathways, but they're also considered when we describe the motor pathways. Right. So the main motor pathway, is what we call the corticospinal tract. So how we name these tracts or pathways, we name them from where they're coming from to where they're going to. The motor commands generally come from the cortex. If you want the finer detail, it will tell you that 40% will come from parietal lobe, 40 again from 30 from frontal, 40 again from frontal. If you want the finer detail, but just know that for now, the descending pathways, the cortical, it's coming from the cortex. Spinal, it means that it's going to end in the spinal cord, from where you get an alpha motor neuron, or what you guys use to describe as spinal nerves when you're doing your regional anatomy, right? This is the corticospinal that controls those regional nerves, for example, that are exiting to create a brachial plexus, a lumbar plexus, or whatever, right? So the main pathway is what we call corticospinal, but we have something called the corticobulbar. So you've done head and neck, and you know most of the cranial nerves in the head and neck, some of them were purely sensory. For example, cranial nerve number 1, number 2, and number 8. Then some of them were mixed, some of them were purely motor. So the cranial nerves that have a motor component, they also need some input from these pathways. That's where we talk about the corticobulbar. Older books will refer to them as corticonuclear. It's almost the same thing. So corticobulbar or corticonuclear, it just refers to the same pathway of a motor input or motor innervation to the nuclei of cranial nerves. And so we have corticospinal, then we have corticobulbar, right? So this concept becomes important for motor pathways. An upper motor neuron is a neuron. For lazy people, we just say an upper motor neuron is a neuron in the central nervous system, though it's not entirely correct. The lower motor neuron is the neuron that exits the ventral horn of the spinal cord, the one that exits as the alpha motor neuron. Right. So the alpha motor neuron is the one that is going to exit.
No way.
And Tino, could you mute? Okay, so the lower motor neuron is the one that exits the ventral horn of the spinal cord. And these are now the alpha motor neurons that are basically going to control the distal or the skeletal muscle. But the upper motor neuron is the one that we have coming from the brain. So what happens with this corticospinal tract? For starters, we'll just say it comes from the motor cortex. Right? Though it gets input from the parietal cortex and other things, it comes from the motor cortex. From the motor cortex, it will descend as a corticospinal tract. It will pass through something that we call the internal capsule. You come to see these things when you do the upper part of the brain. It will pass through the internal capsule, then it will pass through the midbrain, particularly within your cerebral peduncle. When you do midbrain, you describe something called the Kernohan's phenomenon. Not important now. Then it goes to the brainstem. But remember, I said the right brain controls the left body, the left brain controls the right body. So a corticospinal, for example, this one, that is coming from the left. When it gets to the lowest part of the medulla, in the region of the pyramids, it creates something called the decussation of the pyramids, such that it crosses to go to the opposite side. So when you see a corticospinal tract inside the spinal cord, it will now be traveling on the side where it is going to innervate muscles. In the brain, it's traveling on the opposite side. But at the lowest part of the medulla, just above the foramen magnum, where medulla becomes spinal cord, the corticospinal is going to cross and it's going to go to the contralateral side. In this case, it's crossing to the right side, and it will travel in the right spinal cord until a point where it exits the spinal cord. It will be on that side. So when I did the descending tracts, not that the ascending tracts rather, we say that in Brown-Séquard, if you get a hemisection of the spinal cord, in terms of motor sensations, you're going to lose motor sensations on the same side. Why? Because these corticospinal fibers are already traveling on their side. They would have crossed higher up in the medulla. Right? So corticospinal would decussate higher up in the medulla. Right? This one here, this is a general slide that is telling us about descending spinal tracts. There are quite a lot of them. Some of them originate from the cerebral cortex, for example, the corticospinal that I've just told you. Then we have others that are coming from the brainstem. For example, I'll mention something called spinotectal. Right. It would be useless for me to run down these functions without telling you the specific tract. So I'll do tract by tract and we discuss function by function. Right. Right. So if you want life to be easy, back then, I remember I would just say we have a pyramidal tract, then we have extra pyramidal tracts. So the pyramidal tract is the corticospinal, which is the direct pathway which is going to influence muscle. Right? What do I mean? The corticospinal, I said, it will come from the brain, decussate in the lower medulla, then it will go to the contralateral spinal cord, where it will influence the alpha motor neurons. So from alpha motor neuron, you go to muscle, right? But muscles are different. Remember, we have flexor muscles, we have extensor muscles. So we need other pathways that regulate those movements. For example, we have vestibulospinal, which will regulate with posture. So it will basically go to the extensors of your lower limb for you to be able to remain standing, for example. So any other pathway that is coming down, we refer to it as an extrapyramidal pathway. What do extrapyramidal pathways do? Your extrapyramidal pathways will influence the posture. They will influence the muscles. For example, even the flexor muscles, I'm going to talk about a rubrospinal tract coming from the red nucleus. So these are now postural, as opposed to the direct pathway, which basically is going to help with the regulation of tone and muscle contraction, the day-to-day things that we have been used to describing in anatomy, right? So just know that we have a pyramidal, which is the corticospinal, then everything else will become extra pyramidal. Why are we calling them extra? They're extra because they're going to help or influence with other functions, such that if you lose them, you don't necessarily lose the ability of muscle to function, but what you lose is the ability to have maybe a normal posture or whatever, depending on the tract that we are talking about. Right. So the direct one is the corticospinal, the one that I said is coming from the cortex. And I say there's something called corticobulbar. cortical bulba can also be referred to as the cortical nuclear. This is the path or the part of this pathway that will influence the cranial nerves. Remember, we have 12 cranial nerves. If you want to be fancy, there are 13. For the purpose of neuroanatomy, we have 13 cranial nerves. We added an additional one. So cortical bulba, these are influencing your cranial nerves, right? Cortical spinal, these are going to the spinal cord. Then basically they help with everything else. So these are now what we call the extra pyramidal pathways. These are not all of them, by the way. So I like simplifying things. Red for rubro. So ara for ara. Rubrospinal tract originates from a nucleus called a red nucleus that we'll find in the midbrain. So ara for ara, rubro will come from the red nucleus. The rubrospinal will control the flexor muscles, right? There's a clinical for that. So rubrospinal, red nucleus, ara for ara. Vestibulospinal, you've done ear anatomy and you know the vestibular apparatus in the ear. It's for balance, right? So we have what we call vestibular nuclei within the brainstem. There are 4 vestibular nuclei. 3 of them are in the medulla, that is the lateral vestibular nucleus, the medial, and the inferior. Then the superior vestibular nucleus is in the pons. So from the lateral vestibular nucleus, we get something called the lateral vestibulospinal tract. So lateral vestibulospinal tract comes off the lateral vestibular nucleus. If you see other books, they'll call it a Deiter's nucleus, Deiter. It's just the same. What this vestibulospinal tract will simply do is it will maintain balance and posture. And if you want to make life simple, balance and posture, if you go back to your lower limbs, balance and posture comes from standing. And which muscles help you with standing? You'd remember that you think about the quadriceps. The quadriceps will help with the extension of the knee. If you can't extend your knee, basically you can't stand. So quadriceps is one of those postural muscles, and it's an extensor. Meaning to say that the vestibulospinal will actually help with the extensors of the lower limb. Because the moment you start flexing, you can't stand, you can't maintain posture. So vestibulospinal is basically maintenance of balance and posture. It is what we call the lateral vestibulospinal tract. Wherever you see something called vestibulospinal tract, we are talking about the lateral. I know there's a medial, maybe a little bit beyond your level for now, but lateral, it's balance and posture. Then tectospinal. My bad, you haven't done the brainstem. So tectospinal comes from what we call the tectum, the midbrain. Right? So here's what I want you guys to remember. When you eventually do the midbrain, I want you to look up the tectum as well as the corpora quadrigemina, or basically what we call the colliculi. So one of them is for light, one of them is for sound. So every one of you, if you go into a dark room, or maybe just outside, then 50 meters away from where you are standing in the dark, if someone shines a light, even though it's not in your direct visual field, your neck would turn towards that light. Even if there's a sound, you're in the dark, someone just shouts from wherever they are, you're more likely going to turn your head and the neck for you to see that. What simply influences that is a tract called the tectospinal. And this tectospinal is actually closer to where you have the visual and the auditory pathways. And it ends in the neck. Notice I'm just talking about the neck. So it's going to end in the neck. So when you look at transverse or cross sections of the spinal cord, tectospinal, you only see it in the neck. Below the neck, you won't see it. Reticulospinal when you do physiology, the neurophysiology, you find that, remember when I talked about pain, we say there's spinothalamic. But from spinothalamic, we got collaterals, which we called spino-reticular, right? The collaterals that I said will activate the reticular system, and the reticular system will cause diffuse activation of the cerebral cortex, such that you don't sleep when you're in pain. So, what's reticulospinal? At some point, you've got you probably got a beating from your parents. Then, as they kept on beating you, you became desensitized to that pain. Well, some of the explanation will talk about receptor desensitization, but a more neuroanatomical explanation will talk about this reticulospinal. The reticulospinal will now descend to the level where the pain entered the spinal cord, and it will inhibit. So we'll now get a pain getting mechanism. We are now getting pain to say there's a certain type of pain that will allow to enter the spinal cord or to gain access to the cortex. Oh, this pain, we have had it, we are now okay. So if you increase the threshold now, so if you're going to increase the way you beat, they'll start to cry again because they can now feel it. They'll need another descending pathway to inhibit. So reticulospinal will do that. So what I've just told you is a brief overview. Now we can look at the tracts one by one. Right. I also left out the olivospinal, but not really for you guys. Then we have the descending autonomic fibers. So I'll just mention this in passing. The autonomic fibers come from the hypothalamus. Remember, autonomic has parasympathetic and there is sympathetic. So as they come from the hypothalamus, they descend as something called a hypothalamo-spinal tract. Most diagrams like this will forget to put that tract, but it's there. The hypothalamus-spinal tract will carry the sympathetic and the parasympathetic fibers from the hypothalamus. And as it goes down, remember sympathetic outflow will be thoracolumbar. So it's going to end. It's going to give you sympathetic outflow in the thoracolumbar region. And then parasympathetic will be craniosacral. Right? So you have cranial nerves that carry parasympathetic. Then it will also go to the sacral region. Right. So corticospinal, we said this is the main one. It's concerned with the voluntary movement of your skeletal muscle. And I say that they are going to innervate the contralateral side. So a corticospinal tract from the right brain will innervate the left body skeletal muscles. Right. This upper part here, where the cortex is showing a map of the body, something called the homunculus. You do this when you do the brain cortex, where every part of the body is mapped onto the brain. So specific fibers coming from a specific part will help with giving fibers that are going to that specific part of the body, right? So this is the direction of passage of the part of the corticospinal. They pass through corona radiata, but really they will go to the internal capsule. Then they go to the crus cerebri. Crus cerebri is part of the midbrain. Then they go to the pons. It's left out there. They will be in the basis pontis. Then they go to the pyramids of the medulla where they decussate. But as they decussate, now we start to add finer detail. About 85%, that's the exact figure that we use, that is accepted in most books. About 85% of the corticospinal fibers will decussate. Don't worry about the 75 to 90 that is written there. About 85% of them will decussate and they'll go to the contralateral side where they're supposed to go, as the lateral corticospinal tract. So whenever you hear people speak about a corticospinal tract, they're referring to the lateral one because that's the main one. Then the 15% that do not decussate in the medulla, they create something called the anterior corticospinal tract. That anterior corticospinal tract will eventually decussate when it gets to the level where it's supposed to go in the spinal cord. So it will wait to reach the level where it's supposed to innervate, then it decussates. As opposed to the lateral corticospinal, which I said would decussate in the medulla. Right. Then, like I said, there's a map of the body, right? If you want to think about muscle, all the finer details of movements are in your hand. That's why most people, if you have a skill, you use your hand. If you're a tennis player, the skill that you have is the hand. And remember, the hand has those 20 muscles. 5 of them innervated by the median nerve, then the other 15 by the ulnar nerve. So most of the corticospinal fibers have to end in the cervical region, where they will give you the brachial plexus after exiting as the anterior spinal nerves, right? Then the other regions will get very little fibers, right? I wouldn't want you guys to know these percentages, but just know that most of them, they end in the cervical region, right? Then I said we have what we call the extrapyramidal tract. This rubrospinal tract is very important. I want you guys to look up a concept of brain injury called decorticate versus decerebrate. You can even look it up after the lecture, then you tell me. Then I'll tell you whether what you would have found is correct or wrong. But as you try to differentiate this decorticate and decerebrate, just know that in one of those people that is a decorticate and a decerebrate pathway, one of them will have a functional rubrospinal tract. The other one will not. Right. And I said that the rubrospinal tracts are going to help with flexors. So as you look at this upper limb, my upper limb right now, if I'm flexing like this, of the decorticate and decerebrate, one of them will be like this, the other will be like this. It's explained by this pathway and the level of injury. So one of the injuries is just above, well, I'm already telling you, but one of the injuries is just above the red nucleus. The other one is just below the red nucleus. So usually in the central nervous system, when you get an injury, you lose everything below the injury. So just look up this concept of decorticate versus decerebrate and you tell me, right? So this comes from the rubrospinal tract. If you want to be fancy, we'll now say it's from the magnocellular portion, but really these finer details, we'll do them when we do the specific parts of the midbrain. Then we can now talk about how there's a parvocellular pathway and the magnocellular pathway, and you name it. For now, let's just know that the rubrospinal tract controls the flexor muscles. Then number 2, this rubrospinal tract will actually decussate. And when it decussates, remember I said left body will control right. Left brain rather will control right body. Then right brain will control left body. So rubrospinal tract will decussate. And where it decussates, it decussates in what is called the tegmentum of the midbrain. And it creates something called the ventral tegmental decussation. So anatomy is easy. Where there's a ventral tegmental decussation, I'm also going to have a dorsal tegmental decussation. And already I told you guys that there's something called the tectospinal tract. And the tectospinal tract is the one that will create the dorsal tegmental decussation. The tectospinal tract, I say that it comes from the tectum. We talked about what we call the corpora quadrigemina. For you guys, we can use superior colliculus, but this is simply part of the tectum. So these final words may be hard for you guys to know now, but for now, I just want you to know that the tectospinal, like I said, it will end in the cervical region, and it will mediate the responses of the head and neck to visual stimuli plus sound. Sound is not written there, but it's also there. Right? I adopted these slides from someone else, they're not mine. Right? So tectospinal, rubrospinal, then there is vestibulospinal. Remember I said vestibulospinal is from the lateral vestibular nucleus, also known as the Day's nucleus. Right? This will mostly control the extensor muscles, which are your anti-gravity muscles. Right? When I said medial vestibular nucleus, this is not really for you guys, but what I want you to know, when you then do the brainstem, remember I said we have 4 vestibular nuclei. The lateral vestibular nucleus gave us something called the lateral vestibulospinal tract. On the other hand, the medial vestibular nucleus gives us something called the medial longitudinal fasciculus. This medial longitudinal fasciculus, you're going to find it in the visual pathways. So for example, if I turn my right eye to the right, the left eye will follow. There's no way the left eye will look the opposite direction. Already there's pathology if you see that. So how do you get the crossing of fibers to influence this eye to also look that other side? We use this item called the medial longitudinal fasciculus. It's just a bonus point, but you do this when you do the brainstem. But what I want you to know that this medial longitudinal fasciculus, when it extends into the neck from the brainstem, when in the neck, it becomes the medial vestibulospinal tract. It also helps with balance and equilibrium, but just that it's now doing it for the head and neck. So vestibulospinal tract, we refer to the lateral one that comes from the Day's nucleus. Medial vestibulospinal tract, we really talk about this. I'm sure most people don't understand it much as well. Right? Then I talked about reticulospinal. It mediates pain, right? Then other functions are here, right? Control of breathing. All these are other additional functions. It can also be divided into medial and lateral, but I wouldn't want you guys to know that. Then we talked about the descending autonomic fibers, which is say basically descend as the hypothalamus spinal. They come from the hypothalamus, right? And they mediate flow for sympathetic and parasympathetic. So we'll now go to the most important part of this talk, pathology. So there's an upper motor neuron and there's a lower motor neuron. So when you did nerve and muscle, you say that a muscle at rest, even though you are not actively contracting it, it is torn, right? Active resistant against gravity rather. So at rest. So that torn is mediated by the alpha motor neurons. What the upper motor neuron, what the corticospinal tract will do is it will come and influence the alpha motor neuron either to increase tone or to decrease tone. It will also come and influence that alpha motor neuron to move because the command comes from the brain. Right? So imagine this. I usually use this example. I know it's not quite 100% correct as an example, but I'll use it again. You're in a house. So here we have the mains, the power mains. Right? From these power mains, we get power that goes to the socket. Right? So this is the power mains outside. Then in your house, there's a smaller grid to regulate with the switches and everything. Right? So the power mains outside, this is the upper motor neuron. This that is coming from the grid in your house to the plug is the lower motor neuron. Right? So if things are not working here properly and you can't control this grid in the house, that means on this lower motor neuron side, it will work independently. It will not. It will work without regulations. It's like a child in a house without a parent to look out for them. They'll just do whatever they want. So what will happen to tone? If I get an upper motor neuron lesion, there is hypertonia. The tone will go up. Why? Because there is no control. There will be hyperreflexia. Your hands will just be doing those reflexes. No one is inhibiting those unwanted movements. So there's hyperreflexia. Then the atrophy that comes with the upper motor neuron lesion is called disuse atrophy. Remember, there is disuse, then there is denervation atrophy. Disuse, your muscle is atrophying because you are not using it. The brain thinks that I want to walk, but if it is thinking that you want to walk, but there is no communication to the alpha motor neuron to walk, then you're not going to walk. So there is disuse atrophy. It's different from someone with a lower motor neuron problem. The brain will say you want to walk. It's working. It will communicate that spinal cord to that information to the spinal cord. But from the spinal cord going to the effector, there is no communication. So you won't walk. At the same time, that communication, that nerve that was carrying tone to the muscle will not carry tone. So we get something called a denervation atrophy. The muscle will die because it doesn't have any innervation. Even that innervation that it was supposed to have at rest is not there because we've killed the lower motor neuron. Right. So it's a very key concept for you guys to understand upper motor neuron lesion versus lower motor neuron. So what you find in upper motor neuron is the opposite of what you find in lower motor neuron. So when you're starting, I always tell people to be humble. Start simple. I remember when I started knowing these things, I started knowing one side. And as time goes on, if you know one side, then you know the other side is opposite. So you can easily get the other side. Then something that's not written here that I want you to remember is lower motor neuron lesions. They give you something called fasciculations and fibrillations. So when you tap a muscle and it starts to twitch, that's a fasciculation. Fibrillations, you see them on electromyograms. Those are not some things that you do by twitching or clinical testing. So you do electromyograms. I'm sure you do that when you do your physiology. But just know that fasciculation and fibrillations, they are seen in lower motor neurons. Then spinal shock. Spinal shock is basically someone who has a transient loss of neurological function after injury, meaning they will recover, but they will somehow retain their primitive reflexes afterwards. So just know that spinal shock is a transient period of functional loss that follows the injury. It's a different concept on its own, which we'll talk about. Poliomyelitis, in the previous tutorial, I said that it destroys the anterior horn motor neurons, getting something called anterior cord syndrome. ALS, wouldn't want you guys to go much on this. These are more clinical things, but it's also more important in physiology. I taught you Brown sequard. I taught you syringomelia. Syringomelia, I said it's central cavitation of the spinal cord. Then you get something called central cord syndrome. And we then talked about the somatotopic organization, which gives you the different manifestations of syringomelia. Right. So those are what we call descending tracts. So corticospinal, the main one, then the rest are extrapyramidal. Right. So there is about 4 or 5 minutes left, so you guys can ask questions and we discuss. I know you have a lot of questions. You can't not have questions. I would have done nothing. Hello.
Anesu.
Yes.
Okay. So I wanted to know, like when you were talking about the 80% decussating and 10% being anterior, it continues. Were you talking
85,
about all
15.
the tracts or just in general?
No, I was just talking about corticospinal.
Or that is corticospinal?
Yes. So 85% of corticospinal fibers would decussate in the medulla. Then the 15% will remain on the same side. So as they go down the spinal cord, they'll be traveling on the same side where they came from the brain, but they'll only cross when they reach the level where they want to go. Then they'll cross to go to the opposite side, because the concept still remains: the right brain controls the left body, the left brain controls the right brain, the right body rather.
Okay.
Are you answered?
But why? Yes, I'm answered, but I have my head is thinking like the corticospinal is just like a pyramid. And that's what I'm thinking. And my thinking is saying the pyramid is found in the medulla.
Okay. The corticospinal fibers, where they are coming from, the cortex, they're coming from what we call, most of the fibers come from what we call pyramid cells. The pyramids, so the cortex is layered, 6 layers. We have outer granular, inner granular, outer pyramid or inner pyramid, or multiform normally, and the surface one. The output of the cortex is the pyramid cell. Then we have giant pyramid cells called bed cells. So the pyramidal cells are the output that give rise to corticospinal. So that's where the term pyramid came from. They're coming from the cortex, from the pyramidal cells. Then when they go to the medulla, they will cross. And where they cross, people generally refer to it as the pyramids. But where the term pyramid came from, the pyramid cell in the cortex, where they come from originally. That's why I always say it's really easy if we start with the neuro from the cortex going down, not from the spine going up.
Okay.
I hope I answered what you're asking, or
No, I'm good. I'm okay. Makes sense.
yeah, of course, when you go to the medulla, there's a pyramid, there's an olive. I know what you're talking about.
Mm.
But in reference to these fibers, we are not really dwelling on that. We are dwelling on where they are coming from. That's why we call it a pyramidal tract.
Okay, I understand.
So they come from pyramidal cells. You guys have done histology of the central nervous system. I'm sure you must have done that in your basic histology. Nerve is one of the basic tissues, eh? You must have talked about the cerebral cortex. The 4 basic tissues: epithelia, connective tissue,
Oh
muscle,
yeah.
nerve.
Okay.
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 More questions? Tapio.
Ndinama questions Kakaji. But ndakubvunza